Whenever boundaries are talked about in Christian dating, typically we think about sexual boundaries, but we can actually cross emotional boundaries before marriage as well. So in this video, we're going to talk about 5 signs that you've crossed an emotional boundary. And while I'll be directly talking to you in this video, please note that people can try to do this to you as well. Number 1, if you're making commitments you can't keep, then you're crossing an emotional boundary. Ecclesiastes 5:5 says, "It is better that you should not vow than that you should vow and not pay." This verse is talking about making vows to God, but the principle here certainly helps us in our relationships with one another. When we make promises too early in a relationship, it actually decreases the likelihood of progressing with that person. Whereas if you were just to take it slow and not make these promises about the distant future so early in a relationship, then you wouldn't put so much pressure on the relationship and put weight on it that it's not ready to handle. It's kind of like a credit card. It makes you think you have resources that you don't really have, and thus you end up making purchases that you can't afford, thus you go into debt. Likewise, when you make promises that you're not prepared or ready to fulfill, it causes you and that other person to live in a false reality about how serious the relationship really is. And thus you end up purchasing / giving more of each other to one another because it feels like you're more committed than you actually are. Number 2, if you're talking about a future you haven't made the sacrifices to receive, then you're crossing an emotional boundary. Now, don't get me wrong, you certainly do need to talk about future goals and what you hope to experience one day so you can make sure you're properly aligned with this person that you're interested in. But there's a difference between that and talking about the future in such a way where it makes you feel like it's going to happen and that you're making promises to each other again. So, for example, you don't need to talk about what names you like for your future children. You don't need to talk about how you're going to spend the Christmases together once you're married and you're not even close to marriage. You don't need to talk about what type of house you would love to buy with each other in the distant future. Those things just create a false feeling that you two are headed that direction, even though the relationship has not progressed that far. In general, when it comes to goals, it's best to talk about them as little as possible, because when you talk about a goal, it can allow people to validate it, and then you feel like you've actually done something. Like, oh, I'm planning on going to medical school. I'm planning on being a lawyer. Okay, that's cool, but you haven't done that. You haven't gone to medical school. You haven't become a lawyer. And when you get a little sips of validation because you're talking about your grand goals, it diminishes your motivation to actually go out and do the hard work necessary to achieve those types of goals. In a similar way, that same thing happens in relationships. When you talk about the future in a way that is unnecessary, it makes you feel like you've done that and you really haven't. You haven't made those sacrifices yet. Proverbs 10:19, too much talk leads to sin. Be sensible and keep your mouth shut. Number 3, if you're making agreements in your heart about things that have not yet occurred, that's a sign that you're crossing emotional boundaries. An agreement is when you choose to believe something that hasn't yet actually occurred or something that's untrue. As Christians, we always want to live in the truth. Therefore, you don't want to say things like, I know this person is the one, when you don't yet have the actual evidence that this person is the one. You're going to know for sure that they're the one on your wedding day when you're professing your vows to each other. Before that, you need to leave room that this isn't a for sure thing. You don't want to say something like, I know this person could never hurt me. Because when you make that agreement, you're saying, I think this person's perfect. And then when they do hurt you, it's going to be very difficult for you to forgive them and see them like you used to because you were idolizing them. And that usually leads to a demonization after you've committed an idolization. You don't want to say something like, that person hurt me in a way that I'll never recover from. Because then when God actually is bringing the healing, you won't be able to receive it. Number 4, if you're asking a person to heal a wound that someone else created in you, that's a sign that you're crossing an emotional boundary. We all need the Savior, Jesus Christ, but in sin, we often look for false saviors. So if someone in your past made you feel worthless, you may be tempted to then go to someone else to make you feel valuable. If someone betrayed you and now you have trust issues, you may then ask a different person to be this perfect person that will never betray you and to be your perfect one, so to speak. If you feel like you've lost something core to your identity because of a past sexual sin, you may then ask someone else to love you sexually so that you feel like you can still be accepted in that area of your life. And I say all that because when you're going to someone else to solve a past wound, you're crossing an emotional boundary. Jesus has to heal of these types of things. Only He can save us, and only He's going to be the one that validates us to show us our worth, to show us that He's the perfect one that will never betray us, to show us that He's the one who puts His perfect purity on us through the gospel. Jesus alone really is the Savior we need. And number 5, if you're beginning to depend on somebody in a way that would compromise you if they were no longer in your life, that's a sign that you're crossing an emotional boundary. The truth is, you should only fully open up to someone emotionally once you're actually married to that person, because that's the commitment that you're saying, I will never leave you, and that person is saying, I will never leave you. And as a dating couple or as you're in some other relationship, it may feel like you've made that commitment towards each other, thus you may feel like it's okay to be fully open, but the reality is that's not true. You haven't actually made that commitment until you're living in the marriage covenant. So until you're actually married, you have to leave room in your heart to know that this could possibly end. You don't want it to end, but you have to know that this is a possibility. And biblically, it's our job to guard our hearts. And so you have to leave space in your heart before marriage to say, this is not my spouse, even if you really think this is going to be your spouse one day. Once you're actually married and you're protected by the covenant of marriage, then you can fully open up to each other. Here's a related video where I talk about how you can connect physically with someone before marriage without sinning. I'm Mark from ApplyGodsWord.com. I'll see you at the next video. God bless.